Well, thank you, Melanie, and thank you for the foundation for bringing me out here. It's actually a tremendous honor to be an academic researcher in the concept of hope, and to actually see a conference on the science of hope is just so awe-inspiring. So thank you to Melanie and to the staff. I also want to thank John Thunheim, who actually started all of this. So John's the reason that I'm out here the first time as well as the second time. So thank you, John, and the Thurston County group here, and Thurston Thrives. So thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and pull up the slides. Yeah, thank you. So I want to start by indicating that I'm a quantitative psychologist. I went to college to study statistics and research methodology, and my goal in graduate school, as I've said time and time again, was to never work with people. So how I came across the concept of hope and the work that I do is kind of intriguing to me. So basically what I want to talk a little bit about today is whether or not the concept of hope is important, and the meaning behind the word hope, and from an academic standpoint, how we define it, how we measure it, and why we would argue that hope is critical for the capacity to flourish. So I'll start off by talking about where I found hope, how I became interested in it, and basically it happened several years ago. I was working with a nonprofit organization, and as Melanie said, most of my work is focused on human service organizations and helping them assess the effectiveness of their programs with the clients that they serve. And I was working with an organization that provides services to people living with HIV and AIDS. And I was sitting next to a young man who was probably about 19 years old. And he was a big young man, and he had some piercings and tattoos and all this. And I started talking to him, and what I learned was that a couple of weeks previous to this event, he learned that he was HIV positive. And when he disclosed that to his parents at his home, they kicked him out of the house, and he was currently living under the 11th Street Bridge in Tulsa. And what struck me by this young man and the conversation that I had with him is the fact that he was actually happy. In the conversations that we had, he was very engaged. He was engaged with those around him. You could tell people around him liked him at this organization. And so, I was reflecting on that from a personal level, how I would respond to the adversity that he's experiencing all in a short amount of time. And so the idea is hopeless, right? And the answer was no. He was very happy. He was very engaged, and that intrigued me. So fast forward about a month from there, and I do a lot of work with the United Way in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma in particular. And so I was visiting with all of the executive directors of the United Way agencies, talking to them about outcomes research, and I made the comment in passing at the end of my presentation. I said, I'm kind of interested in this concept of hope. And as I finished that conversation, I actually had a microphone, and I handed the microphone back to the chair of that group, who's the executive director for the prevention of child abuse and neglect in Tulsa. And she stared at me for what felt like an hour, but it was probably about 2 seconds. And she made this statement. She said, "You can't measure hope." Now, earlier I made the comment that I'm a quantitative psychologist. I study statistics. I'm also pretty competitive. And so when somebody tells me I can't do something, I'm going to try pretty hard to do that. But I actually believe very seriously that I can measure anything, and I can measure hope. And it's based upon this fundamental idea that anything that exists to some degree, and therefore can be measured. It's the idea that high hope individuals behave and think differently than low hope individuals. And because of that, we can actually assess that. And so what I want to start with in terms of the title of my first slide was hope as a theory of change. And I firmly believe that hope is the theory of change for individuals. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So I like this quote from Laura King in her research, but basically at the heart of social change is the human capacity to understand the way things currently are, but to, more importantly, to understand and to believe that things can get better. And that's the core foundation of hope. So within the field of psychology, what we're interested in is understanding the psychological strengths that help individuals, groups, and communities thrive, right? That's for those of you who may have a bit of a background in psychology, that's a little bit of a difference in the last 15 years to the way it was in, say, the last century. The way that I was trained in psychology, and most all people in psychology, is trained to understand human pathology. That is, we're trained to understand what's wrong with people, right? And so this idea of understanding psychological strengths is at the heart of trying to understand what's right with people and to focus on those strengths that help people overcome stress and adversity in their lives, right? So positive psychology has identified there are 24 character strengths or 24 psychological strengths, and you can see a few of them there on the screen. Self-control, courage, zest, hope. But it's these 24 character strengths that have been identified that when maximized allow individuals to flourish, right, in their environment. What's important about these 24 character strengths is that these are character strengths that are valued across culture, right? Hope is valued regardless of the communities that you're from, regardless of the part of the planet that you're from. Hope is the same. It's a fundamental aspect of the human condition, right? And so when we think about the idea of meaningfulness, the idea of the capacity to flourish, what we're really referring to is whether or not a person is engaged, whether or not they have positive emotions based upon the experiences of their lives, whether or not they can engage in positive social relationships, and that they can experience meaning and purpose in their lives. So when I say well-being or flourishing, that's really what I'm talking about. It's not just this nebulous idea. So it's meaning, it's engagement, it's achievement, it's personal relationships that matter, that really make life worth living, okay? So what we also know from these 24 character strengths is that they're known coping resources that help individuals overcome adversity and to be able to cope with stress. What's really intriguing to me as a hope researcher is that the empirical evidence that has emerged in positive psychology, that of these 24 character strengths, hope has emerged as the top predictor of this capacity to flourish, right? So empirically, we know hope matters, right? Now, I do want to say in that context that hope does not happen in isolation, right? You can't necessarily have hope without having zest or courage or perseverance or some of the other character strengths. But hope is the catalyst that brings the other character strengths together that allow people to thrive. The capacity to think that I can look at the way things are now and that things can be better, right? So let's talk about what is the definition of hope. How do we understand this concept of hope? And Sean kind of indicated to it yesterday during the keynote, during his talk. And when we follow Rick Schneider's theoretical model, that hope is basically the capacity of an individual to identify meaningful pathways or viable pathways to the goals that they set. So the first component of hope theory is that we have desirable goals. And it's a fundamental part of the human condition that we are goal-driven beings. From the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to bed, we are trying to achieve a goal of some sort or goals. And so the idea with hope theory, the fundamental aspects of that, is do we have the capacity to identify pathways or strategies to goal attainment, okay? So the first part is pathways thinking. The second part is agency thinking, right? And that is the mental energy, the capacity to direct and sustain mental energy towards those goal pursuits. The best way to think about agency is to think of it as willpower. Do you have the willpower to pursue the pathways and to pursue your goals, especially in the presence of adversity? Now, I'll say this since it seems to be appropriate during lunch. What we also know about willpower, and the first keynote speaker, Lawrence, talked a little bit about the importance of self-control. I don't know if you guys remember that part of his presentation, the importance of self-control, which is a key fundamental aspect of agency, right? This willpower. What we know from the science of hope and from the science of self-control and willpower is that it's finite. That in a given day, we have a certain amount of mental energy that we can direct, and it can be depleted, right? That is, the more that we direct mental energy towards something, we are depleting willpower, right? So there's research that shows that willpower is connected to glucose, right? And so what is glucose for the human body? Energy, right? And so nutrition matters, right? I think that's very important to think about with the concept of hope, is that nutrition matters, you know, especially if you think about young children in school systems and the nutrition that they may or may not be receiving. So the hope theory is just a real simple idea. It's the goal-driven behavior and the capacity to think about pathways and the capacity to utilize willpower towards those pathways. The other thing that I'll highlight here is that high hope individuals can oftentimes articulate multiple pathways towards a goal. So if they are faced with adversity, they can easily come up with an alternative solution. What we know empirically about low hope individuals is they do not have that capacity. They oftentimes are unable to think of multiple ways to attain a goal and have difficulty overcoming barriers. Right? So this idea that we have to have willpower and way power, or agency and pathways, are the key components of hope, but both are required. If we have a goal that we're trying to attain and we have a lot of willpower, we really want that goal, a lot of motivation towards that goal, but we have no pathways, we have no strategies to attain that, we're considered low hope, right? We're considered low hope. Alternatively, if we have mental strategies or pathways to attain a particular goal, but we're not motivated for those pathways, we're considered low in hope. So I think about some of the work that I do with court-ordered batterers and domestic violence, right? How much willpower are they directing towards the program services that they're court-ordered to pursue, right? They have low hope oftentimes towards that particular goal. The other thing I want to highlight is what's important is the goal. The goal is desirable by the individual. And sometimes we'll look at individuals and think that there's some conflict or adversity going on, and it might be worth considering that your goal is not the same as their goal, right? That they may still be a high hope person, they just have different goals than you have. So when we have a desirable goal and when we have the willpower, right, the high motivation towards that goal, but we don't have the pathway. Earlier I mentioned that that's the definition of low hope. That's actually the definition of a wish, right? So think about that for a second. So you guys might say, or wake up in the morning and say, I hope it doesn't rain today, right? It's actually an incorrect use of the term hope. What you really mean is, I wish it wouldn't rain today, because while you're motivated for the goal of no rain, you have no pathway to make that happen. Okay? So how do we nurture hope? Again, this is from not only our research, but the research of others in different settings. Most of my research comes from human service organizations, people living in at-risk or vulnerable situations. But basically what we know is that the first thing that we need to do when we want to nurture hope is we establish goals. Now, goals can't be just like, for instance, for me growing up, I was going to be a professional baseball player, right? I had all the right stuff, I thought, right? And so that doesn't mean I'm hopeful for being a baseball player, because I have to have the agency, which I had, but I didn't necessarily have the pathways, right? So the first aspect of nurturing hope is to establish the goals. And goals have to be established in specific detail. It can't just be this nebulous idea of I want to be a professional baseball player. It's I want to be a professor at the University of Oklahoma teaching research methods and statistics, right? That's my goal, right? And there are pathways to get there, right? There are known pathways with known benchmarks that can help give me a feedback process that I'm on the pathway to my goal. So once we establish the goals, what we know from goal setting is that the first thing that happens is the agency, that is the willpower, is slightly elevated at that point in time. People start to recognize that there's a goal and they desire it. So their agency increases, which is the perfect time to start thinking about developing viable pathways, right? And so basically agency and willpower work off each other. As you increase agency, you increase pathways. As you increase pathways, you increase agency, and that kind of thing. The third block is something that our work is introducing to the hope theory, and that's this idea of creating future memories. What we know about this idea of the prefrontal cortex or the human brain is that we have this capacity to close our eyes and dream about what the future may be, right? And so what our work is suggesting is that this is a critical time when people have identified the goals, they've identified the viable pathways, this is a perfect time to stop and to begin to create the future memories of what that success is going to look like and feel like. All we're really doing is reinforcing agency at that point in time. We've established the pathways, as you might remember, so we're just really reinforcing the agency. It's also a good time to begin to identify and talk to individuals about what are some potential barriers that you might experience so that you can begin to identify the pathways around those barriers. So that's how we actually nurture hope. We can change hope. We can improve hope. Right? So the benefits of hope. So the science of hope, basically what we know is that we have higher hope individuals or hopeful individuals have more positive pro-social behaviors. They have increased capacity for self-control. Hope serves as a coping resource against stress and adversity. We have higher levels of goal attainment. And by the way, there's a tremendous amount of work. I saw the book out yesterday by Shane Lopez, Making Hope Happen. Fantastic book, by the way. Explains the hope theory very, very nicely. But Shane's work basically has identified the educational impact of hope. And what his work has shown is that higher hope students have lower absentee rates. They have higher GPAs, higher graduation rates, and higher college going rates compared to low hope students. Right? Basically, what we know from the literature is that high hope individuals are more likely to experience social, psychological, and physical well-being. So alternatively, what do we know about low hope individuals? Low hope individuals will likely recognize their deficiency in pathways thinking. They're likely going to recognize the fact that they're unable to attain the goals or not as likely to attain the goals, so they face new challenges with pessimism and negativity, right? So what we also know is that lower hope individuals tend to report higher levels of negative affect. They have higher levels of depression. They have lower goal achievement. They have reduced problem-solving skills. And again, they're more likely to exhibit negative externalizing behaviors. So here's the question. What is the opposite of hope? Despair. And that's the one I almost always get. What we know about hopelessness, now remember, hope is about having goals. It's a motivational theory. It's about pursuing goals. It's about identifying pathways. So the opposite of that is actually apathy, right? Apathy. That's the opposite of hope. That's what hopelessness looks like. Okay? And that's critical to see. Now, I teach statistics at the graduate level, and I teach statistics to social work students, right? So how many people do you think want to be in that room, right? Besides me, 'cause I'm all in, right? So it's this idea of when students come into my classroom and it's this class they have to get through, it changed completely the way that I teach statistics, because now I have to see myself as a pathway to their goal. I'm a pathway of them graduating and doing the good work. And why is research methods and statistics important for social work, right? And it's this whole evidence-based practice model that they need to understand. It doesn't matter anymore that they can hand calculate a Pearson product moment correlation, although it's a tremendous amount of fun. But there's no need to do that. What's more important is, can they understand what a correlation means and what are the clinical applications or perhaps policy implications of that information, right? So it changed the way that I think and teach from a hope perspective. So the first stage in hopelessness is rage, and that's important for us to stop for a minute and recognize that hope is a cognitive theory. Hope is a thought process. Emotions are an outcome of hope, right? As we pursue hope, as we begin to experience success, we will experience joy and happiness. As we experience goal blockage or difficulty in identifying pathways, we'll experience anger, frustration. And so if the individual is unable, and this is kind of critical, and there's some really interesting work with people who have a significant goal blockage, like not being a professional baseball player, right? So it's this idea, can I re-goal? Do I have the capacity to shift my goal from something that I can't attain to something that is similar or some other desirability? Can I make that shift? If I'm unable to make that shift, then rage flows into despair. That's where despair comes in. But notice, for instance, because many of you said, or those of you who did say, said despair was the opposite of hope. But what is despair, right? What is despair, right? It's kind of a frustration. It's kind of an emotional fear, angst, those kinds of things. And all of that is mental energy that's still directed at that goal, right? Which is still part of the hope process. And that's why apathy is the opposite of hope. Okay? So just real quickly, some of the studies that we've conducted. We've conducted close to 75 different studies in Tulsa, across Oklahoma, and now some national-based studies. Some of the things I was interested in early was the issue of adverse childhood experience and hope. More importantly, what I was interested in, or our team was interested in, is how does trauma impact hope, right? What does that look like? And so we've conducted a multitude of studies with the adult homeless. I'm sorry, I've got bifocals that are relatively new and I'm trying to see, right? We've done a kind of an interesting study where caregivers who were bringing children in for the investigation of child abuse while the children were going through a medical examination, we were able to survey the caregivers with regards to their ACE and HOPE scores. Basically, it turns out that a higher ACE score tends to correlate with a lower HOPE score. No big surprise. But again, that work isn't really out there, so that's why we conducted that. The next study that we were interested in was this idea of parent-child relationship qualities and how does hope relate to parent-child relationship quality in the context of child abuse prevention. So abuse has happened, we're trying to prevent it from happening again, and so we're trying to improve the parent-child relationship quality. What is hope's role in that particular study? So we've done a multitude of studies. What we found is that parenting stress is one of the better predictors of the potential for child abuse and neglect. But in the presence of hope, those negative effects of parenting stress go away. Right? What we also found from that study is that the program services of the prevention program actually increased hope among the parents, therefore mitigating the negative effects of stress. I thought that was pretty interesting. I do want to point out one thing, it's a little bit heart-wrenching, is that this is an agency that works with children between the ages of 0 and 5, and working with the child therapist, they've described to me how an 18-month-old, how you can behaviorally see an 18-month-old child lose hope in a caregiver. We've studied it in a domestic violence shelter to look at increases of hope and safety, substance abuse treatment, compassion, fatigue, and burnout. So I've heard some presentations and conversations in here about your own well-being. And if you're burned out, how do you transmit hope to the people that you serve? So this was a nationwide study on child abuse pediatricians, where we looked at compassion, fatigue, and burnout, and we know that higher levels of compassion, fatigue predict burnout. But again, empirically, what we found was that the negative effects of compassion fatigue go away in the presence of hope. Right? That's pretty cool. Mindfulness is a pathway to hope. We've done 3 or 4 studies on mindfulness. We've done that in the presence of alternative sentencing for women, where we've got a mindfulness intervention program for that group and studied hope. And social connectedness and hope. Turns out when we ask people, in times of trouble, do you have somebody that you can turn to? And the response, yes, no, or unsure. What we find is that people who say no or unsure have significantly lower levels of hope compared to those individuals who respond yes. So it kind of gets at that idea. I'll talk a little bit more in just a few minutes, if I've got time, on the social hope as a social gift. Right? By the way, 2 large studies where we replicated the social connectedness and hope, right? In times of trouble, do you have somebody you can turn to? Yes, no, unsure. Those were at 2 large churches in Tulsa. And the people who said no, 43% of the people who said no were married. So one of the things in visiting with Melanie and Krista and others was, can we measure hope for people attending the conference? So the answer to that is, of course we can. I can measure anything, right? Right? So 114 of you completed the survey, the link that we sent out. And so I had all this data analyzed on Sunday before I flew out from Oklahoma. And of course, Melanie says, hey, I think we can get more. So let's do it. So last night in my hotel room, I'm crunching numbers trying to update this. So thanks for that. I'm in Seattle and I'm in my hotel. So here's what we measured. So we measured hope, and we measure hope using the Adult Hope Scale from Rick Schneider. For those of you science geeks, I put just a little bit of the information, score, reliability information. I won't go into that. Unless I get real stressed out, then I will, because that's kind of my comfort zone. But we measured hope, we measured positive affect, negative affect, we measured flourish. Remember what I said earlier about engagement, positive relationships, positive affect. And then we measured life satisfaction, which is the subjective evaluation of your life. How good was your life up to now? So that's what we measured. All of those had good psychometric characteristics with this group. So the first thing that I had, and by the way, I'm not really good at animation, so sitting in my hotel room, I couldn't figure out, because this should be a big wow. But basically, so imagine big wow. So the red scores are your scores. The green scores are the adult homeless scores on hope that we've studied. And in Tulsa, where we did the adult homeless study, using the point-in-time count, this study actually captured 46% of all the adult homeless in Tulsa participated in our study. So obviously, significantly lower levels of hope. But I'm able to break that down in between. It's not, you can't see it on the slide because I moved it too low again. Sorry about that. The tall, off to your left, is the total hope score. The next one over, where the score is 27.3, that's pathways. And then 27.2 is agency. So we're actually able to, within this measure, isolate if you're higher or lower in hope. Is it in the pathways area or is it in the agency area, right? Which, by the way, if you can measure that, then you know where to focus your work, right? Right? If you have lower pathways, then you know that it's about cognitive behavioral types of scripting versus motivational interviewing types of techniques. So once I compared you to the adult homeless, I thought, okay, well, I will break scores down into high hope and then what I classify as lower hope, because you guys all had relatively high hope scores. It's important to remember what I'm going to present now relative to the adult homeless, because you're more hopeful than the adult homeless. But I was able to categorize you guys into high hope and then lower hope based upon the measuring technique. And what we find is that with the idea of affect balance is your positive affectivity, your happiness, minus your negative affectivity. So higher scores mean that you're a more positive person. Lower scores, if it's even a negative score, then you're more likely to be a negative person. So you guys are basically positive, but what we see is that people who are higher hope score significantly higher in affect balance. You're more positive, right, compared to the lower hope people. By the way, all of these differences are statistically significant. So this is the positive affect. Again, the blue is positive. The red is negative affect. And the two groups are high hope individuals and lower hope individuals. So you can see that the higher hope people who filled out the survey scored dramatically higher, almost 10 points higher. Or I'm sorry, 2 points higher. I got excited about the big jump there. But their high hope individuals score lower on negative affect. Again, those differences are statistically significant. So what I want to highlight is that higher hope individuals do better. Higher hope or hopeful individuals tend to experience life in a more positive framework. But now let's take the scores and look how hope relates to the other indicators that you filled out on this survey, which is flourishing and life satisfaction, this well-being issue. And basically what we see is that hope, your scores on hope, have strong relationships with positive affect. Higher scores on hope are associated with higher scores on positive affect, lower scores on negative affect, higher scores on flourishing, and higher life satisfaction. Higher hope individuals do better, right? And those differences were statistically, or those correlations were statistically significant. Now, next, I want to present this result, which is how is hope predictive of well-being beyond affect, right? We know that people who have higher positive affect tend to see life more positively. So if we control for that statistically, what is hope's role? And what we find is that hope is the single best predictor of your well-being beyond affect, right? Now, I ran this particular analysis because even though earlier when I showed that your hope scores were higher than the adult homeless, these are the exact same findings that we have for the adult homeless. These are the exact same findings that we have for parents who are in prevention programs for child abuse and neglect. These are the exact same findings that we have for people in domestic violence shelters, right? So for all of this is what we have for food pantry program studies that we've conducted, that hope is the single best predictor of the capacity to experience life in a positive way, right? And what I want to highlight here is that hope is about the power of we, not what we're doing for them, right? Or what they are doing, or what they are experiencing. Hope is a fundamental aspect of the quality of life for all of us, right? And we can measure it. So hope does not operate in a vacuum. Hope is a social gift, right? And the way that we interact with other people matters, right? Each and every one of us in this room are pathways to somebody's hope, right? So I think about myself as a professor and how I can diminish or allow or nourish hope in the students that I interact with. I think about my 7-year-old granddaughter. I think about my 7-month-old grandson. And how does my interactions with them nourish their own hope? The other thing I would say is that while I do most of my work in the human service organizations, we've done some of these similar studies within organizational behavior type things. So this idea of how as a leader, as an associate dean, how is it that I'm a pathway of hope for the employees that report to me, right? And so I start to think about the application of hope that transcends just the human service role. Again, it's a fundamental aspect, catalyst for the good life. So we know that children need a supportive environment, and more importantly, children need at least one caring adult in their life, right? A cheerleader, so to speak. The literature, the empirical literature is very clear on nourishing hope with children, right? They need a positive adult in their life. Again, as I mentioned earlier, education programs that target hope tend to see an increase in academic performance. Human service organizations find the same things as education. And as I mentioned, the literature is growing on this, but hope leadership has been shown to increase performance in the workplace and reduce turnover among effective employees. We also know that in the workplace, hope can mitigate burnout. So again, each of us are pathways to those around us. And so what I would hope, or what I would think, is that we need to be mindful of the way that we impact others. So in conclusion, I would argue that number one, we can measure hope. It is something that can be measured, and that hope matters.